Hello and welcome back to the Reframework training. In the previous videos, we've learned about how the exception handling and logging mechanisms are set up in the framework. This video illustrates how system exception handling, business exception handling, and logging work. Furthermore, we'll see how a process responds if it encounters the maximum number of consecutive errors. Additionally, we'll see what happens if the parameter ShouldMarkJobAsFaulted is set to true. Automated processes running in production rely on the execution log to evaluate processing results and diagnose issues. We'll also learn how to check the results in Orchestrator. Okay, so how do we generate the exceptions? For system exceptions, we'll use the built-in crash mechanism in UIDemo. We'll check the Enable Crash Simulation option and set the error occurrence to Often. This checks that our demo app will throw a system exception when running. We can now close the app as the settings are automatically saved and ready for use when the robot opens it. For business exceptions, we've already implemented a rule in the process workflow. We compute the sum of the values stored in a transaction item. And if the sum is greater than the threshold defined in the config file, then we use a throw activity to generate a business rule exception. In the config.xlsx file, we can see that the manual transaction threshold is set to 10,000. Okay, so if the sum of the cash-in, on-us check, and not-on-us check values are equal to or more than 10,000, then the process will throw a business exception. The max retry number is set to 0. From the configuration file lesson, do you remember why? Indeed, because we're dealing with queue items and therefore the process uses the retry mechanism provided by Orchestrator. Moreover, max consecutive system exceptions is set to 3, which means that the process will stop when 3 consecutive system exceptions occur. ShouldMarkJobAsFaulted is set to true. Job will be marked as faulted in Orchestrator when a process encounters a system exception in the initialization state. Now we have a complete picture of our process parameters. If an exception occurs, either from the business rule or a system exception, we can evaluate how the process should respond. Keep these parameters in mind. Here we have the information about the transaction items. Of course, to test the exception handling mechanism, we've added 10 items to our Orchestrator queue, of which some hold values above the threshold to demonstrate a business rule exception. Let's check the number of retries set in the Orchestrator while we're here. For demonstration purposes, we've configured the queue to allow only one retry in case of system exception. As seen in the previous videos, the retry mechanism can be configured directly in Orchestrator or by using the config file. Do you remember when and why we use one option or the other? Going back to Studio, we want to make one small adjustment before testing our process. The plan is to execute it in run mode and not in debug mode. We want the timeout value for UI automation activities to be lower so that we don't wait much for exceptions to occur. Let's go to Project Settings, UI Automation Modern, and reduce the timeout run value to 5 seconds. Great, we're all set. Now let's run the project and follow the execution in the output panel. We can see that our automation process is opening the UIDemo app, authenticating, and processing each transaction in the Orchestrator queue. Now the target application has crashed while processing transaction number 1. Since it's the first system exception, it's logging the consecutive system exception counter as 0. It captures the screenshot of the error that gets saved in the Exceptions Screenshots folder. The robot closes the application and opens it again. But then it crashes again while processing transaction number 2. Since we had another system exception consecutively, we can see that consecutive system exception counter is updated to 1. We've got a few system exceptions logged. Let's adjust the error occurrence to medium so that our process can advance through the remaining transactions faster. Okay, the execution is done. Are you wondering why we have 15 transactions? Well, there were 10 items to process, but 5 failed, so we retried them. This resulted in 15 executions in total. So far, we've mostly checked execution results in Output panel. If we check transaction number 1, for instance, we can see that it failed with an application exception. The same goes for transaction number 2. Meanwhile, transaction number 3 fails with the business rule exception. It breaks the chain of the consecutive system exceptions. Hence, consecutive system exception counter is reset to 0. Now, let's check the transaction item status in Orchestrator. To do this, we go to the Queues section in the correct folder in Orchestrator and select View Transactions for our queue. This is where we can check the processing result of an automation built using the reframework and queue items and placed into production. Here too, we can see that one of the transactions failed with application exception. Furthermore, if we click More Actions, View Details, we can find out more about each transaction. For this one, we can see the specific data, the exception type, the reason with the screenshot, and that it was retried successfully. Now let's look at a transaction that failed because of a business exception. The reason is that the sum of the transaction items is 30,153 and therefore exceeds the configured cap of 10,000 for automated processing. A key aspect is that it is a business exception. Thus, it must be analyzed and verified by a person. Hence, this transaction wasn't retried. We can see this in the Output panel as well. Are you curious about what happens when the maximum consecutive system exceptions is reached? Great, let's see it in action. Let's configure UIDemo so that it crashes often. Also, we've uploaded a new set of transaction items to the same queue. We've already published this project to Orchestrator and mapped it to the correct folder in Orchestrator. Let's run this process from Orchestrator. The job has started. The robot opens the application, starts processing the first transaction, and it throws the first system exception. The robot opens the application again. And the application crashed. It throws a second system exception. As we expected, it opens the application for the third time. Again, it crashed, and we have a third system exception. As a result, the process ended. And we can see the error messages here in Orchestrator or in Assistant. There's one other point to check here, as we've set the ShouldMarkJobAsFaulted to true. The max consecutive system exceptions caused an error in the initialization state. As a result, the job is marked as faulted. Great, everything worked as intended. With this, we conclude our overview of how exceptions are handled, logged during execution, and viewed in Orchestrator. Here are a few questions that we hope you can answer. What are the next steps which follow a caught business exception in the process transaction state? What about for a business rule exception? Where can you find the list of queue items and their statuses in Orchestrator? How can you find out why a queue item failed? In the next video, we'll learn about one of the biggest advantages of the producer-consumer model and the reframework, distributed workload or concurrent queue consumption. Thank you for watching and see you soon.